Hello, Hello, friends. Welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, a podcast dedicated to SQL Server-related topics, which is designed to help you become more familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features or ideas, and how you might apply them in your environments. I'm your host, Kevin Fiesel. Today on the podcast, we have two special interview guests, Carlos El Chacon and Steve Stedman. Carlos and Steve, welcome to the program.
Well, thanks for having us, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. This is exciting.
Absolutely. So we're on episode 100 of the SQL Data program.
Well, thanks for having us, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. This is exciting.
Absolutely. So we're on episode 100 of the SQL Data Partners podcast.
Woohoo.
Oddly enough, you also have a podcast. It's weird how that works, huh?
Yes, this is an interesting turn of events here.
So, Carlos, what made you decide to start podcasting?
Wow, that's a great question. And I guess I will say that if I knew how much time and effort it was going to take, I don't think I would have started it. So I knew that I wanted to engage other folks and start talking about SQL Server in kind of a long form way. I've been doing a bit of blogging, ultimately looking to help my consulting practice or relaunch it really in a way. And so kind of that content marketing, right? So taking the long view of having content available that people can interact with, find search engine optimization. Found that difficult. At the time, there were only two SQL Server podcasts in iTunes, right? Which is with the main place where people go to find, podcasts. And then there's lots of apps that will carry the podcasts that are in iTunes, and Google Play has come out there. So ultimately I thought, well, gosh, okay, there's really only these two, and Greg SQL Down Under new episodes hadn't been there for a while. And I'd taken John Lee Dumas's course on podcasting and thought, hey, you know what? Why not, right? Let me jump in. Let's see what happens here. I guess I'll try to do 10 episodes. So before I actually officially launch, I'll do 10 recordings, see if I like it, see if I can actually get 10 people to sit down with me and talk. And what's weird is that, so I actually started the podcast when I was in Costa Rica. I took my family over there for 2 months, and we were down there. And while I had done
What are the most
SQL Saturday, I kind of officially started doing interviews in Costa Rica. So again, that's kind of a long answer to why I started it. I thought there weren't very many people at the time doing podcasting, and I thought I would give it a try, kind of see what happened, and wanted to commit to do it for 1 year.
So when it comes to things that are time consuming, things that are kind of beneath the iceberg, what are the most time consuming parts of creating a podcast episode?
So, and Steve, I think you'll attest to this. The first is just getting used to hearing your own voice.
Sure. And realizing when you're doing that you don't always have to do it over again just because it doesn't quite sound the way you were hoping it sounded.
You don't have that ability to do the editing, right? So like in the written word, you can edit. Oh, that doesn't quite sound right. Let me go back. Let me tweak that. As you do that, audio-wise, it gets a little cumbersome. Trying to remove all the ums and ahs and whatnot. In the beginning, I wasn't using an editor. I am now. That happened actually in episode 29. That started happening. And so I would have to edit my own. Well, so first it's scheduling the guest, picking the topic, creating the agenda, actually having the interview, making sure that I had questions, so the prep work associated there, then editing it, writing show notes, getting links together for the show notes page. So those are some of the pieces that are involved. But the biggest piece in the beginning, again, I had those 10 episodes, and I had told people that in August 2015 is when I would first start. So August came around and people started asking me, hey, have you launched that podcast yet? And so literally, again, I was down in Costa Rica for that week. I spent getting everything ready and did a lot of editing and that, right? No, listening to everything again, trying to figure out, okay, is this okay to keep? Again, you don't know what people are expecting. You don't want to disappoint the people that you've interviewed, all of those things. And so, yeah, those are some of the components that went into it.
Yeah, I remember really early on when we first got together for I think it was episode 13,
Right.
You had a little piece of paper where you're writing down, okay, this many minutes, this many seconds, that's where somebody said something really bad. I've got to cut that word out.
Right. No, exactly. Yeah. So I guess, so it's interesting the way that process has changed a little bit. We've gotten some good feedback from the show. And now the process is we actually just record it, how it is. I take it off for transcription, and then I get the transcription back and I edit the transcription. And then Julian, our editor, great guy, will actually then edit out anything that I don't want there, in addition to all the ums and whatnot, which he does, I think, a great job of. So that's some of that, how that process is.
And that
I was doing it. Yeah, I wanted to write that down because I wanted to try to speed that process up.
So just to add a little bit more on the time-consuming parts of it, I mean, the one that Carlos does most of the time is the scheduling of the guests. And I know that one takes up a lot of his time. But then once we have the guests scheduled, it's a couple different recording sessions that we go through in order to get an episode out. We'll have the session with the guest, which can be one or more guests, and that's usually at least a week before the podcast airs, and sometimes it's as much as 3 or 4 weeks at a time when we have a lot in the queue there. But that's usually about, a half hour to an hour of preparation time we go through there to be ready to talk about whatever the topic is. And then it's usually about a half hour to an hour of actual recording time. And that gives us the section that's the part where we're talking with a guest. And then about a week before the podcast airs, usually the Thursday before the podcast airs, then about a week before the podcast airs, usually the Thursday before the podcast airs, we do our intro and closing. And that's where we go in and we talk about the SQL Server in the news. We talk about any mentions that we've had out there. And then we go in and sort of digest what we talked about with the guest at the end as well. So I think that's usually about an hour of time to put that together.
Yeah, that's true.
Once we've done that part, I don't know, maybe Carlos, you can jump in with any additional time, but it's kind of handed off to the process through the editor and through the assistant that we have in getting that all published.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess thinking back, just because we do have that process now, which helps quite a bit, but there is still, each of those individual pieces do take some time.
Oh, I can imagine.
And then once it's out, then there's promoting it. And I don't always get around to doing that myself, but we try and do what we can to promote the podcast through Twitter or LinkedIn or places like that, so people know that there's a new episode. It would have been promote the podcast through Twitter or LinkedIn or places like that, so people know that there's a new episode.
Right.
Cool. So next question. I'll start with you, Steve. What episode was your favorite?
Wow. Well, if you'd asked me a couple weeks ago, I would have had a different answer. But I think that episode 99, I thought was one of the favorites that I've done. If I had said that previously, before episode 99, it would have been the indexing episode that we did with Randolph West.
Okay.
But just the whole imposter syndrome conversation that we had with Mindy on episode 99, that was different than a lot of things we talked about before, and I loved it.
Yeah, I just listened to it yesterday. It was great. Well done, Mindy.
Yes, she did a great job.
Very much so. So, Carlos, what was your favorite episode?
Gosh, that is a tough question.
Choose among your children.
That's right, exactly. So generally, because I'm a more the merrier type of person, the ones that I have really enjoyed have been the ones where we've had kind of a panel type discussion, right? So I think about episode 59 when we had Andy Mellon and Mariano Covo on. I think about episode, what was that, when we had the panel from the DBA Tools folks on.
Oh, that was episode 90.
91. There we go.
A lot of fun.
Right. So those, even the one that we did, which ironically enough, you and Jonathan had that great interchange and I didn't get it in the program, but the ones that we do at the SQL Saturdays, right? Where we have kind of multiple people kind of giving their input or thoughts around. I mean, again, not that the individual interviews aren't fun, but getting different perspectives just makes the conversation flow much easier. Different things come up that Steve and I haven't talked about beforehand. It enables the conversation to go in different places.
Nice. What has been the most pleasant surprise for you in the making of the show?
I think probably the continued relationships that I've been able to have with the guests. Now, that's not to say that all of the guests are now my best friends, because that's not true. But for the most part, I'm just looking here at the list here. For the most part, I have continued conversations with my former guests in some way, shape, or form. And so I've really enjoyed that, right? I think being able to connect with folks that I wouldn't otherwise have been able to do.
How about for you, Steve?
Well, I think it's a lot of the same lines as what Carlos said, but I would go a little bit further to say it's not just the guests, but it's also the guests and the listeners.
Sure.
There's been a lot of listeners who have reached out to me and connected on LinkedIn, a lot of people follow on Twitter, but it's nice, but it's really nice when someone will connection there. Getting to know people and just the reach of who you know in the SQL community.
Right. I guess I want to add one thing there, and that is there have been more than one guest I've reached out to, and they're like, "You want me to do what?" and I guess I'll point one out in episode. Let's see, all of a sudden, so in episode 45, so Wolf up in Pittsburgh, right? He was the nervous wreck. And I say that lovingly, right? But he did not think he had the chops, right? Basically, which is again ironic for a guy like him. But so it took me a little while to convince him, right? To hey, let's do this. Let's make it happen. And then when he finally did, to kind of see that boost in confidence, it was well received. We had some comments on it, and so that was very gratifying as well.
Cool. So here's a question that came in from Shane O'Neill.
Database corruption.
My memory is getting a little faded here. I remember when we first met, and that was at Past Summit. How we met is Steve came onto my radar because I can assure you I was seeking him out. He was not seeking me out.
Well, I can remember the first contact we had was you reached out to do episode 12 in regard to the database corruption challenge.
Oh, was that first? I couldn't remember if that was first or not.
And then I had no idea who you were at that point in time, but I figured, hey, it's a podcast. Why not? I'll do it.
Sure.
And then I think that was sometime in the spring that we recorded that. And then it was at Past Summit in Seattle in October of that year that we met in person. And I think that was at the chapter leaders meeting or something like that. Gotcha.
Okay. Well, there you go. Yeah. So ultimately, I guess
up and joined.
This is how we ended up connecting.
So your first meeting wasn't when you guys woke up and adjoining bathtubs full of ice with notes that read, "You've lost a kidney. Please call 911." That was later.
No, that wasn't with Carlos.
Different story.
The other podcast. Right. So our other question comes from Mel Vargas, who asks, "I'm curious as to who has been the guest you've always wanted to have, but it's not been possible for whatever reason."
So I feel like in order to protect the innocent, I can't honestly answer that question. People for a variety of reasons don't want to come on. For the most part, I've had a very good success rate, right? So this is show number 100. I've had 3 people I've only had 1 say no. I've had 2 that have said, yeah, talk to me next year. But I think you can kind of, you might be able to deduce just by the people that we've had on who might not have accepted the invitation.
But hold on, just because we haven't had them on yet doesn't mean that they've said no. It might mean we haven't had a chance to ask them too.
That's true. So like I said, in 2 cases, I emailed them. They're like, hey, talk to me next year.
Yep.
And I, follow up with them and they're like, talk to me next year. I'm like, okay, well, you can't be that busy, right? 2 years in a row, you can't take 30 minutes to chat with me. I'm like, okay,
There were a couple guests that we took a long time to get on the show.
No, that is true.
Like I think with Chuck on the SQL replication episode that we did recently, he and I talked at Past Summit, and then it wasn't until I saw him again at SQL Saturday that we actually kind of got around to saying, yeah, we'll definitely do it. And then it took a few weeks after that to get it all scheduled. And then wasn't there another one, Carlos, that I talked at Past Summit, and then it wasn't until I saw him again at SQL Saturday that we actually kind of got around to saying, yeah, we'll definitely do it. And then it took a few weeks after that to get it all scheduled. And then wasn't there another one, Carlos, that took a long time that you just with schedules? I forget who that one was.
Yeah, so it was episode 64. Patrick Thomas with the Microsoft. He had just moved over to be the Microsoft like certification or like the MCP manager.
Yep.
And I actually reached out to him when I first started, right? So this is 2015, and he just kind of kept blowing me off. I went out to Seattle, which is he's out there at Redmond, and I said, "Hey, I'm in Seattle. Can we meet?" And then it was like Friday at like 5 p.m. He emails me and says, "Hey, can we meet?" I didn't see it till later, and I was getting ready to fly out, and I'm like, "Sorry, man." And then I tracked him down. He happened to be one of the night last year, 2016, and so I said, "Hey, you're here, I'm here. Let's do this." And he said, "Okay." So I probably sent, 30 emails to that guy, trying to get him on the show. So,
and I think we had a great episode once he was on the show.
No, that's right. The conversation was really good. I thought it was, very, very interesting. And then he introduced me to Graham Malcolm, who is one of the writers for the Academy program that Microsoft is doing. And so, it was. I thought it was well received, and he seemed to enjoy it, but just took a while to get there.
Very nice. So let's switch gears entirely away from podcasts. I want to talk a little bit about consulting. So both of you are now independent consultants, yes?
Yes.
How long have you guys been independent on your own or together, independent together?
Sure. So I'll let you go.
I originally started as an independent consultant about 12, 13 years ago. And when I did that, it was going well. And then I ended up with one client that sort of ended up taking up all of my time. And then after about 2 years of being, quote, independent with only one client, they brought me on as a regular employee. And I was there about 7 years. And then it was about 2.25 years ago that ended. And I went back to true freelancing at that point. I said, I don't want to go and get a regular full-time job because that's not for me. I like the challenges of consulting and working with lots of different clients. And then it was so I did that. I started my own company doing that, Stedman Solutions. And that's been going great. And then about a year ago, Carlos asked me to join him on the podcast, not in any more business relationship than that, but I joined in and started helping with the podcast. And then about 6 months ago, maybe 8.
So for me, this
more business relationship than that, but I joined in and started helping with the podcast. And then about 6 months ago, maybe 8 months ago, was when we decided that we would merge together between what the two of us do much more closely. So now I still have some clients I work with under my old brand at Stedman Solutions, but most of the new work that we're taking on is under the SQL Data Partners brand, doing independent consulting there.
Yeah, so for me, this is my third attempt. and
third
so,
time's a charm.
Yeah, that's right. The third time's a charm. And so, in fact, Steve and I were just talking about this earlier, and that is one of the things that I wanted to do was make money in the way that I wanted to make money, which it can be difficult, right? And so it kind of got in fits and starts. I've told people before that, so originally I started consulting because I saw other consultants making a very high hourly rate. And lots of people do the hourly rate thing, and that's all the great consultants, and it's great and whatnot. Just because you have a great understanding of SQL Server, at least, again, from database consultants, does not necessarily mean that you will make a great consultant or business owner, entrepreneur. And that's really the most important key, is to stop thinking yourself as a database person and to start thinking yourself as an entrepreneur. And because those two things are different and they get attacked differently. And so was part of my learning curve in these kind of stops and starts.
Okay, so let's say we have somebody in the audience who says, I'm ready to go independent. Any of my employers who are listening, I'm not that person in the audience, but we have somebody in the audience who's saying, I'm ready to go independent. And hey, you just told me that being an entrepreneur is a completely different story. Well, what types of things do I need to think about before I take the plunge?
Marketing, right?
Yeah.
What kind of problems are you going to solve? I think, we have, as a full-time employee, people come to us with problems, right? Either that's a ticket, an alert, right? But the work comes to us. So now as a consultant, the question is, how are you going to find the work, and what type of work are you going to respond to? And making sure that that you understand what that work is and can describe it to other people.
Yep. I think I'll echo the same thing there. And I think that, like, when I talk about how this is really my second time on the independent consulting, where I had been doing it before and then it turned into a single client, part of the reason that happened was at that point in time, I didn't know what I was doing on how to go out and make contact with those new clients, how to meet the next customer. And I think that, and that's something you can do and you can practice and you can work with, is just who is in your network or who do you know that you can make contact with that could be providing you work. And it's surprising as a work with that I never would have necessarily considered as a prospective client in the past.
Right.
So, but I think other things to think about for someone who wants to jump out and give it a try on their own is the security behind it. And how secure are you? Or yeah, exactly, or lack thereof. Now, I think that when you have a regular full-time job, most of the time there's the illusion that it's fairly secure. And I use that term, the illusion, because through whatever happens in people's lives, full-time jobs can come to an end at any point, whether it's a company going out of business or a layoff or just someone not getting along with their manager. That job can come to an end. But you generally have a lot more protection there legally in different ways as a full-time employee, and you have much more security in that you know if things get slow for the company, odds are that you're still going to be getting a paycheck 2 or 3 weeks from now. But with a full-time position, that's pretty stable. You know that every full-time position, that's pretty stable. You know that every so many days you get a paycheck and it's generally for about the same amount. And I think that when you go in the consulting, that changes significantly because you run into what they call bench time, or a point where you don't have enough work for a while. And that comes back to finding your customers and your marketing and reducing that bench time. But when you've got that bench time, you've got to have, depending on how you're paying yourself, because the customers pay your business and then you pay yourself out of your business, you've got to have a buffer there so that when you do have short times that are either bench time or a period where it's hard to get payments from clients, that you can cover it. And I know that, and I think it'd be different for maybe a single person versus someone who's married with kids. But I know that if what I'm doing, if suddenly I stop having money to contribute to my family, I'm a little bit late on payment. That is, one, you need to have a little bit of savings in place so that if you've got a 2-week period where all of the clients decide they're going to be a little bit late on payments, you can weather that out without having a lot of financial pain right there. And then the other is, around that is you've got to be kind of really hard with the customers when they are late. And I know that, that's a challenging thing to do, but to be able to come back and say, I can't keep working on this project if you're not going to pay.
Right.
And fortunately, it doesn't come to that very often, but I think just being in a position of financial stability, and I like to use the number of having 6 months of bare minimum cash that you would need to survive in the bank in order to start out doing consulting. Because when you start out, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to have more expenses than you need, but there's going to be a lot of things that are challenging in that first 6 months, and a lot of them are going to come down to financial challenges.
Yeah, and I think just to echo there,
months and a lot challenging in that first 6 months, and a lot of them are going to come down to financial challenges.
Yeah, and I think just to echo there with Steve, who talked about that transition from the tech space to the entrepreneur space. So the soft skills become much more important there. Right. So he mentioned kind of, dealing with client payments, but that whole process of just interacting with people, right? Once you go independent, you are no longer just interacting with technology. That idea is dead, right? Your clients are customers or are people, and you have to satisfy their kind of needs first, if you will.
Right. So at what point do you guys engage the services of, say, a lawyer or an accountant?
Yeah.
Great question. Do you want to take that, or you want me to jump in, Carlos?
Yeah. So I take the accounting perspective. That was from day one, right? I wanted an accountant there to at least be able to handle some of those things. So it kind of goes. So next, right? If you've taken an economics course and one country makes coconuts really well and the other one does bananas, right? They trade. So that is kind of that idea with hiring an accountant. Unless accounting is your business, get somebody to help you with some of those things, because the IRS does not mess around, at least, in the United States. I can only imagine for other countries, right? So you don't want to get started off on a bad foot there.
And a little bit more on that. I mean, I don't want to be an accountant. That's why I work in SQL Server. I want to do things with SQL Server. If I really wanted to do accounting, I probably would have taken accounting in college and gone that direction. So because of that, I mean, there's a lot of people out there who are great at what they do at accounting, and I would rather engage an accountant when it's appropriate than try and learn all that on my own. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean that I want to be completely illiterate on the accounting or financial side. That make it so that a lot of the stuff that you might normally need a bookkeeper for, that you can do yourself. And then you can engage an accountant when it comes to tax time and all the appropriate times that you need to use an accountant there. An interesting story, on this, when I first started back into freelance a couple of years ago, I engaged an accountant that gave me some really bad advice and didn't feel quite right at the time, but it came from my accountant, so I believed it. And then later I found out it was bad advice and that it made my first year's taxes very challenging to get done that year. And looking back, I don't work with that accountant anymore, but I work with accountants and I do a little bit more checking on their background and get a better understanding of who they are before working with them.
Yeah. From the legal side, generally that's just in the review process. So at least so it's going to vary state by state. And of course, obviously country by country, what the requirements are for setting up a business. Generally, at least with me,
there's a lot of people.
A business. Generally, at least with me, I had an attorney just kind of review some of it, those things, or at least, consult to make sure I was doing the right things. My accountant actually helped quite a bit with some of the legwork to help reduce some of that cost. So,
and I think that, the key is use lawyers as needed. And I think that there's a lot of people who gripe at lawyers and what they do, but when the time comes that you really need a lawyer, and again, I don't want to be a lawyer myself. I don't even want to try to attempt that. It's good money spent usually because you're in a position that you have to use a specific expertise that you don't have.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if nothing else, again, kind of those soft skills, relationships, you want to be on speaking terms with someone before you have a need for their services, right? So you'll want to kind of shop that around or get somebody you feel comfortable with rather than somebody that you have to have because you have no other.
And I
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about the database corruption challenge. Steve, what made you come up with this idea?
Wow. It was interesting. And I think that there's a lot of detail that Carlos actually asked me this on episode 12, where I first was on the podcast. Yep. It started out initially because I do a lot of blogging on SQL Server topics, and it started out that I wanted to share some of my knowledge about database corruption and fixing it. And I started writing a blog post about how to fix corruption by pulling data in from non-clustered indexes to try and figure out what was missing. And I realized that, anybody could do that. Anybody could write a post like that. So I thought, I'll change it up a little bit. I'll go and actually create a single corrupt database. And I'll put that in the blog post as a training exercise to see if people are interested in trying to solve that. Saturday, I think I did that on a Saturday morning, and I threw it out. I put it on Twitter and a few things. And I thought, okay, no big deal. Nobody found it interesting. And about 8 hours later, though, it got some traffic in that Brent Ozar picked it up and he decided he was going to jump in and solve it. And he solved it pretty darn quick. I think he and his fiance at that point were trying to head out to dinner when he saw this, and he stopped what he was doing and fixed the corruption before going to dinner. And that might have caused a little bit of trouble, maybe being a little bit late for dinner. But he was the first to solve the first week of the corruption challenge, and then he tweeted about it. That sort of got the fire going there a little bit around more people being interested in it, because I think he has a little bit more of a reach on Twitter than I do. And
he can move the internet numbers, that's for sure.
Yep. And after he solved it, then a handful of other people jumped in to solve it. And it's that point I realized, hey, this is really interesting. There's a lot of people jumped in to solve it. And it's that point I realized, hey, this is really interesting. There's a lot of interest here. I'm going to do another one. And then I kind of quickly made some rules and decided, okay, I could do this for 10 weeks. And that was my initial plan, was 10 weeks, but it turned out to be 10 competitions over about every 10 to 14 days, not every single week.
Mhm.
And it just kind of grew from there. There were about 60 to 70 people who actively participated week after week. And it just kind of evolved at that point. And it wasn't that I ever sat down and thought, I'm going to build this corruption challenge. It was just sort of a blog post that evolved and became the corruption challenge.
Yeah, I remember it being a big deal. And it's still really interesting to go back because, hey, those corruption issues, they still happen today.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Right.
And I think today I get a lot of traffic. If you go to stevestedman.com/corruption, you can get to all of the blog posts I've done, as well as all of the 10 weeks of the corruption challenge. Check it out there. That even though it's been 2 years, people are still learning from it. And I think almost everything that I covered in the corruption challenges is still valid today, even in the latest versions of SQL Server.
So how much did you learn during that challenge? When you started out, obviously the first database, you knew how to do that. You put the example together. When we got to some of the later databases, did you already know that stuff beforehand, or did you have to go research more reasons for corruption?
Oh, I certainly did not know all of that when I started. I knew a lot of it, but it's one thing to know about a type of corruption, and it's a whole nother level to know enough about it to go be able to create it in a database that can then be backed up and distributed for people to try and fix it themselves. There was some times where I thought, okay, well, here's something I know what the corruption is, but it took me 4 or 5 hours to go and actually build a test database that had that kind of corruption in it.
Right. And then to make sure that, can I fix this? Is this
kind of way participated actively in the corruption challenge were incredible to be able to learn from. And I know that the participants in the first few weeks were very helpful, but they were also very critical in a positive helping kind of way. If anything that I tried wasn't quite right. And there was 1 or 2 of the weeks that I put out a corrupt database, and then somebody pointed out some flaw, and I had to go back and correct it in order to make it so it could actually be fixed by someone.
So of the solutions that you got, what was the most unexpected and interesting solution?
The most interesting and unusual one that I came across was from Patrick Flynn, and I think he's from New Zealand, and I think it was for week 4 or 5, somewhere around there in the competition. And it was one that it was a particularly nasty corruption scenario, but what he did, and one of the reasons I loved it is because I like CTEs, and I actually wrote a book on common table expressions a while ago, but it really used CTEs creatively. And it was one that I actually adapted, and I used it in my presentation at Past Summit last year on database corruption. But what he did is, using some temp tables and CTEs, he was able to use the dbcc page command to extract all of the data in horrible binary format into temporary tables. And then from there, use CTEs to manipulate and extract all the data out of those temporary tables and reconstitute it into insert statements to rebuild the table from scratch.
Wow.
And I mean, if we had an hour, I could walk you through the whole demo of how it works. But there were a lot of really awesome solutions, but that's the one that just jumps out at me as, wow, that one was vastly superior. Not vastly superior. It was the most interesting and the one that I enjoyed working through the most. And part of the process when I did the challenge was it was a
Nice conference.
getting people submitting solutions, and I'd have to go through and confirm that their solution actually worked. And that one probably took me the longest amount of time to understand that it worked, because it was so interesting and I just wanted to dive in and totally understand every single thing it was doing. And I love that example. That's my favorite out of all of them.
Very nice. Let's switch gears again. We're going to talk about a very nice conference. Carlos, why did you pick such a hard name to pronounce for CompaCon?
CompaCon? Yes. Well, because I didn't consult you, number one. And then I guess, have you tried finding a URL lately? Right?
This is true.
Yeah. And ultimately, this is an extension, or what we hope to be an extension of the podcast, right? So this idea, bringing people together, talking about SQL Server in different ways, ways that people might be using today, or think in ways that they haven't considered, right? With new features, or, just different ways to attack on Twitter, attack different problems, like Patrick's solution for the corruption challenge, right? Just sharing that type of information. And so actually, before I launched the podcast, I wanted a name for the people who listen to the podcast, right? So that we can kind of create a, sense of community. And that idea of the compañero kind of came to mind. And we put a little video of this together out on Twitter, or on YouTube rather. But so compañero is a Spanish word for companion. As a missionary for my church, I had a companion. And so we were compañeros. This person, we were together, 24 hours a day. And this is for two-year commitment. And so having good companions along the road just helps things go smoother. Again, that was kind of this idea for the podcast of, we want to get people together to talk about helping you get from, one path to the other. And Steve and I are both together to talk about helping you get from, one path to the other. And Steve and I are both actually big scouters, which we didn't find out until kind of after we'd started talking. And so that idea of being on the trail, right? Like, known paths versus unknown paths. And if you have a guide, just how much simpler that makes everything. So that's ultimately where the idea of Compañero Conference came from. And then we've been developing that idea with the hopes that people will come, right? You get access to folks that maybe you don't know, but that and I hate to use the word vetted because it's not like,
extreme vetting.
Yeah, I went through everyone's, records, IRS, background checks, all that stuff. No, these are people that we felt comfortable inviting, I guess is the word, to share because we knew that they would be willing to share some of the experiences and do share some of the experiences and do so in a way that would be positive for those who came. We hope that people will come, get some shared experiences, get some help, be able to ask questions with things that they haven't yet faced, but also then be able to, when they get to a trail or a scenario that they haven't experienced before, that they'll be able to reach out and ask more than just Google.
Right. So, Steve, what are you looking forward to with CompaCon?
The biggest thing I'm looking forward to there is being able to meet more of the people that we interact with on the podcast and meet them in person. And whether it's the speakers that are going to be there or the attendees as well. I'm excited about the business venture, of course, in doing the conference. Really what it comes down to is getting to know the people. And
right.
Yeah, that's it for me there.
I will say one other thing, and that is I remember, again, being a full-time employee and not using my training budget normally because the budget was not high enough to go to some of these other conferences like Past Summit, right? That required, the travel across the country and things. And so we wanted to, could we create something that people could afford within the budgets that they have and still come to something that's not somebody opening up a book and you're getting canned slides, right? That's not helpful. I mean, and so that was another element to that is through the listeners, they were getting value out of the podcast. We thought, okay, well, what value can they get when we get together? And can they leverage some of those budgets in a way that that it'll get approved, right? That meets the criteria of a conference and also allows them to, expand their network a bit.
Another thing to add to that I'm really that quite often you go to a conference, you sit in on a session for an hour or a half a day or whatever it may be with the speaker. And then when that's over, it's over. And you go back to work a couple days later and you try and use some of the things you've learned. With this, we've near the end of the conference, we have an office hours slot. You'll be able to meet with any of the speakers that are there to be able to discuss or talk or find out more about the topics that were covered in their presentation.
Right.
And I think to me, that seems like a lot of fun.
Yeah, and because of the way the setup is, we're going to sprinkle that in with a little bit of hands-on learning, right? Yep. And so, yeah, I think that will be a slightly different take. Because, again, I think it would be a little bit more authentic, right? These are going to be – so one of the things that we're trying to do, I hate to use the word canned, and we'll have some scenarios that people can walk through individually, but we're hoping that most of this growth is kind of organic in the sense of, hey, you know what, Kevin, I know you're talking about security. I'd like you to show me this security thing. Can you help? Can you walk through with this? And then people just start talking, conversations ensue, and you're getting, again, let's take a look at that. Here's how you do this, right? So still kind of quote unquote hands-on, it's organic.
So the conference itself will be October 4th and 5th in Norfolk, Virginia. And I hear there's something involved with a boat.
Yes, we are going to have an evening cruise. So down there, and all of a sudden I can't remember the name of the river, but we're kind of very close to the Chesapeake Bay, one of the rivers that shoots off of the bay. And of course, Norfolk is a big naval yard, and there's lots of traffic in that area. So it's a very pleasant. It'll be in the evening. The sun will be going down. So we'll get to go out 2 hours out on the boat. We'll actually eat dinner there as well, and have a little bit of fun. There'll be a top deck, open air. You can go out and just hang out again, have some conversation. Or
I'm claiming dibs.
The second level will have food and dancing, and the third level is just kind of relaxing. Enjoy the weather.
And you are welcome to come along, even if you don't want to be part of the dancing.
Yes, that's right. Yes, we want to be very introvert friendly. And so while we can't get that third section just to ourselves, if it's everyone's intention, we can definitely go over and push everybody else out.
I am claiming dibs on the nice spot against the wall. This sounds like it's going to be a blast. How about we talk about SQL Family now?
Let's do it.
Okay, so how did you first get started with SQL Server? I'm going to start with Carlos for this one.
Yeah, so this is I think I have the atypical answer, and the accidental DBA kind of fits, but so I wanted to be in networking. Networking is what I wanted to do. I did an internship for Cisco Systems. The company that I'd worked for was purchased by Cisco Systems, and so I wanted to do networking. That's what I wanted to do. I went to college, wanted to get my CCNA, all that stuff. My first job was working for a small consulting firm, but was kind of doing their internal IT. So it was 15 consultants. So I was doing things like email, networking, exchange, I guess email, security, and then setting up environments for the consultants so they could test things and whatnot. And SQL Server kind of came along with that as they were doing some of the applications. One of the consultants leaves and goes to work for the state. He calls me a couple months later and he's like, hey, they have this database administrator position. I think you should apply. And again, I'm harking back to my college days where I took 2 database courses. I hated both of them. It was adjunct faculty, right? It felt very canned. Like, I don't really know. And again, I'm harking back to my college days where I took 2 database courses. I hated both of them. It was adjunct faculty, right? It felt very canned. And I was like, no way, like, you're crazy, right? Like, don't. And he calls me back and he's like, hey, we're having a hard time filling the slot. Like, I think you should, I don't even know how to be a DBA. Like, I don't really know anything about it. And he's like, well, this is what they pay. And I was like, oh, interesting. And again, so I was a job right out of college. I graduated in 2002, right at the end of the .com bubble. So I felt fortunate actually to have a job at entry level. And so I said, well, you know what? It was a significant jump from where I was. And I said, okay, I'll do it. They had SQL Server and Oracle there. So they had an Oracle DBA. And I applied and got the job. And so basically figure out how to do it in SQL Server. And so that's kind of how that started.
Interesting. So how about you, Steve?
Well, just to, I guess, echo one of the same things Carlos said, with databases and classes in college, I had a couple database classes in college. I hated them. I could not stand database work the way that it was taught at the university at that point in time. But while I was in college, I ended up getting a 9-month-long internship working at Microsoft. This was in 1990 when Windows 3.0 had just released. Just to set the time frame there, they were like everyone they could hire that was in computer science at all from the local universities, they brought in to work in tech support for Windows 3 right after it released. And I learned a lot there, but I didn't want to work in tech support.
Sure.
I wanted to be a programmer. And so I did everything I could to try and move from that position. And I ended up taking on and lo and behold, there was this database thing that Microsoft had just started. They suggested we use, and I'd never heard of it. And they said, well, what we need to do to get you up to speed on this is send you to Microsoft University, which was an internal training course they had then, and for a week-long class on how to use this thing called Transact SQL. On December 12th of 1990, I received a certificate that said I'm qualified to use T-SQL.
For the record, I do not have that certificate. I'm not qualified.
Yes. So, and that's sort of an Easter egg that I put on my blog, was my parents found this in their house, this certificate, like 15, 20 years later. No, it was more than that. Yeah, 20 plus years later. And they gave it to me a couple years ago. And I scanned it in and I put a copy of it on my blog as a blog entry from 1990. Even though blogs didn't exist in 1990. So if you check out stevestedman.com, you can scroll back in time and find that there if you're looking for something that's maybe a bit funny to look at. But anyway, so that was a 9-month-long gig at Microsoft. And then I went back to school, and then I went to do another internship and back to school and on to jobs and all that. And it seemed like every job that I ended up needing to do something with SQL Server. And then it just sort of evolved into more and more database work. And I finally realized that I didn't want to be a programmer. I wanted to do database side of things. I mean, I still do programming, but it's all database related programming now. And it just evolved into the DBA role. And I had other jobs along the way. Like I ended up as a CTO at one point, and I realized I don't really like that much. I want to go back and do more database work. So started all at Microsoft in 1990, and then it just kind of evolved from there.
Interesting. So sticking with you, Steve, if you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be?
The way that the checkDB command works, meaning that when it runs and can base to make sure that there's no integrity issues there, no corruption. And the problem is that a lot of people don't run that because it takes too long to run. And if there was a way to say, what I want to do is I want to run checkDB, but run it for an hour and check as much as you can possibly check, and then keep track of that. And then tomorrow night, I'm going to kick it off for another hour and continue that check process. That would be a really cool change that would probably help a lot with the way that people do their database checks.
Right.
And I know there's ways to sort of simulate that by saying, I'm going to check some of the tables. But if you get to the point where you've got a database with just one gigantic table, a way to say just run it for a certain amount of time and then pick up later would be pretty awesome.
Makes sense. Carlos, if you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be, and why would it be expanding Polybase?
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth there. Yeah, it's funny. So I was thinking a little bit about. I was thinking a little bit about this because so I went and answered some of these in episode 0. But we've changed the SQL family questions since then. So this is not something that I guess I've had to address. And of course, I think one of the big things we've talked about, so SQL Server setup, even, so in episode 98, right? The first thing you change, lots of things, kind of in there. But as I was thinking about this, and Steve and I were talking, so I'm not a user of it yet, but I guess it makes me nervous. So I guess I'm not sure that it's quite a change yet, but it's something that I hope that they do. And that is with the introduction of services or languages like R and Polybase and who knows what's coming, right? That me, the administrator, right, the knuckle-dragging Neanderthal that I am, who's not a great programmer, trying to, not drowned in PowerShell tools so that I can understand and be able to react to when other people are using those languages in the database. And I realize that's kind of a tall order, help me help other people, right? And because I'm a bit nervous about some of that adoption as it increases.
Okay, so sticking with you, what is the best piece of career advice that you have received?
Well, I'm not sure if it's necessarily the best, but one that often comes back to, and that is the money will come. So when I mentioned I graduated in 2002, that first job, I was making roughly 25% lower than I thought I would be making coming out of college. I was a bit frustrated, right? And even when I moved after a couple of years, in fact, that job where I took the database administrator position, they salary increased my salary by a certain percentage, by more than a certain percentage to fill this thing. And so anyway, I felt like I was, that initial job, my wages were lower than I wanted to be. And I was expressing some frustration. And the comment was, the money will come. if you'll do the best that you can, right? Invest in an episode that hasn't been released yet. So at episode 104, we're going to talk with Eugene and that idea of kind of going deep. So go deep and get to be good at something, right? Get to be good at solving a problem, becoming kind of that go-to person in your organization for certain problems and building trust, and then good things will happen. I'm not a millionaire, right? So I can't. There's a limit there. However, we were talking about family. I have 5 children. My oldest just turned 15, and my youngest just turned 15, and my youngest is 2. Some of this risk and some of these other things, I have to consider them, as well. As you continue to plot along, as you continue to keep your eye on the ball, whatever cliche you want to use there, then good things will happen. And that, I think, has probably been the best piece of career advice there.
Gotcha. So how about you, Steve? What's the best career advice that you have?
I think the best advice, and it kind of comes down to 2, but the first one is there's no such thing as can't. When somebody tells you that they can't do something or that you can't do something because technically it can't be done or whatever, that's just an excuse to go and figure out how to do it. Now, maybe there's an exception to that. If there's like personnel rules or things like that and say you can't do these things, well, yeah, you should follow those. But when it comes to technology, people tell you that something can't be done. I've always looked at it as a challenge to figure out, okay, well, how can I do that? And the other, it's from the original, one of the earlier Star Wars movies, talked about there's no try, there's only do. And I don't like to try things. I mean, I'll try a new flavor of ice cream, or I'll try something new on the menu. I like to do things, and to say that you're going to try something, to me, oftentimes, like, I'll try and do that for you. I'll try and get that job done, whatever it may be. It's kind of an excuse to say, well, I tried, but I can't do it. So that leads back to the can't. So no such thing as can't, and there's no such thing as try, there's only do.
No can't and no try.
Yep.
All right. So, Steve, if you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why?
Oh, gosh. I answered this on episode 12, and I don't remember what my answer was. I'm going to go with time travel on this one, because I think if you could go back in time, I don't think I'd be interested in going forward in time necessarily, but if you could go back in time, I guess I'd have to come forward to get back to where I am. But if you could go back in time and learn from mistakes that have been made, if you could go back in time and learn from mistakes that have been made, either by yourself or from others, or even hundreds of years ago, mistakes that have been made, or just to experience and see what people have done, I think would be an amazing superhero power.
Carlos, can you top that?
I top that. Well, I don't know that I can top it, but mine would definitely be different. It was so in episode 70, Travis Wright, he kind of brought up, he's like, everybody always talks about kind of like the supernatural, but like some ability that they would possess. And he said, well, I would think the ability to control technology would be very powerful, because then you could get it to do all the stuff, right? And you wouldn't have to worry about flaming suits or, hitting somebody when you go back in time, your matter, dimension, smushing together or whatever. And as I thought about that, so that superhero power of being able to, and all of a sudden I can't remember the movie. I want to say it's Terminator, but that doesn't seem right. I think they're actually trying to put in a card and get the ATM to spit out. But I feel like there's some movie out there where they walk up, and they get the ATM to just start spitting out money. And so something like that, right? Although obviously I would do everything ethical, right? Nothing immoral like that, but
especially on the record.
Especially on the record. That's right. I think that would be because then also if I could control technology, I don't know, getting some big drone or something, like, because I previously it was flying. I figure that I can get technology to zoom me around the place pretty quickly.
That's fair. So thank you very much for coming on to the podcast tonight, Steve Stedman and Carlos Skynet Chacon.
And thank you for hosting. This has been great.
Yes, Kevin, this has been fun. Thanks for having us.
Review us on your care now. The laughing at the beginning is by Klonkfield, used under Creative Commons. So that was Carlos and Steve today. It's a pleasure having them on, and hopefully you enjoyed. If you want to see more, go to SQLDataPartners.com/100 and Please follow us on social media. So we're at SQL Data Partners on Twitter, /SQL Data Partners on Facebook, also on LinkedIn. Review us on your favorite podcast platform like iTunes or Stitcher, and we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.